Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or so. We're still admitting a few more people.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to one of our APIC webinars that has evolved from the content of our last APIC conference, which was scheduled for April of last year. And we're delighted to have been able to bring you the conference presentations in webinar format. Today's topic is called a data-driven approach to psychology internship selection. What happened to the concepts of reliability and validity? And our presenters will be sharing their approach with us. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. Some Zoom basics, which feel not so basic anymore, which feel really basic anymore right now, I should say. Because we're in a meeting, everyone is muted. If you need closed captions, please select them from your Zoom toolbar. If you would like to focus on the speaker, you can change your setting from gallery view to speaker view. We encourage you to use the chat box for questions and comments. Jeff and I will be moderating the chat, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. If our presenters prompt you to put something in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. If you choose to use the chat, if you choose to speak, please remember to unmute and turn your video on. And this webinar is being recorded for our membership. If you registered, you will receive an email to complete the evaluation to obtain CE credit. And we will send presentation handouts to all registered attendees and also post them on the website. Jeff Baker, the APIC Executive Director, and I, Shona Vaz, will be the moderators for today's discussion and check in on the chat. And here are our learning objectives for today. Number one, to describe the history of internship selection and how that impacts how selection is done today. Number two, discuss the psychometric limitations of many of the current API variables. Explain the challenges of subjective judgment and its impact on file review and interviewing. And number four, to discuss the benefits of using a more data-driven approach to selection and how you can implement it. I hope that we'll have some time at the end to talk about the API portal and how we might be able to integrate some of these strategies into API review in our new platform. Our presenters are Dr. Wayne Siegel, Dr. Amanda Ferrier-Auerbach, and Dr. Chris Orbis. Dr. Siegel is the Director of Training at the Minneapolis VA. He is the current chair of the APIC Postdoctoral Committee and has served in many other national service and leadership roles, including the APIC Board of Directors, the Commission on Accreditation, being the chair of the VA Psychology Training Council, APA, and is an associate editor for TAP. Dr. Ferrier-Auerbach is the assistant director of training at the Minneapolis VA. She's also the program manager of the Psychiatry Partial Hospitalization Program and has been involved in the training and supervision of interns in Minneapolis since 2007. I'm going to let her introduce Dr. Orbis.
Yeah, so we also wanted to acknowledge Dr. Chris Urbis, who had been a clinician investigator here at the Minneapolis VA. He had specialized in assessment, treatment, and resilience processes for mental health problems related to traumatic stressors. So had a long history of doing research at our VA and had been very involved in our training program for a long time. So he passed away unexpectedly in May of this year, and that has been a huge loss for all of us, both personally and professionally. He'd had a really huge role in our training program and just was kind of embedded in the fabric of multiple programs here at the Minneapolis VA. And so we really want to acknowledge that we had submitted this presentation a year ago with Chris, and want to contribute, really acknowledge and honor his contributions to everything that he's done for us.
All right, thank you so much. Wayne, you are up with your slides.
Okay. And I assume we can see the slides. So moving forward. Amanda, you can take it from here.
Yeah. So I know we kind of went over the learning objectives just a minute ago. So again, it's to describe the history of internship selection and how that impacts how selection is done today, to discuss the psychometric limitations of many of the current API variables, explain the challenges of how subjective judgment impacts the file review and interview process, and then discuss the benefits of a more data-driven approach to selection and how this could be implemented specifically in your setting. Our overview and our aims here. First, we'll start out by going over, briefly, we'll talk about the historical context of psychology internship selection. And then we'll talk about our own evolution process from being more data informed in the early years of when we were doing internship selection to more data driven, which has been more recently. We'll talk about some of the struggles we've encountered along the way, talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the approaches that we've been using. And then we'd love to hear a little bit more about your experiences and your impressions of both what you've gone through and what you've experienced and some of the information that we're presenting today and how that may impact how you do this in the future, how it may fit with what you do.
So a little bit of background and context. Or just to add real quickly. So if people have questions, comments, type them in the chat and we can answer those as well. And then we also would want to hear, maybe examples of how others have implemented some of what we're talking about and benefits and struggles of that as well too. So our goal as internship directors is determine who are the best and most qualified applicants to our programs. I think we all share that sentiment. And historically, this has not been a very data-driven process. I'm not intimately familiar with every program, but I've had contact with lots of programs around the country. And people do this in a very subjective way. So thinking about from a data perspective, and back to Amanda's comment about Chris Urbis, is Chris was a data guy, and he was always suggesting we can do this better. We have data, even if it's not perfect, data will make this simpler and better all around. And kind of that's what drove things for us. So just historically, 94, APIC developed the API, which I think we're all familiar with, a standardized application process. And the goal here wasn't really to develop, I think, like valid, reliable variables. It was to kind of get consensus around the community to develop a standardized application. Prior to that, all programs had different applications. That was my experience when I applied. So the API was a huge improvement over what programs had been doing before. And so developed a standardized application in 2008. It evolved to an online process where the data could now be downloaded and programs could try and use that data. And I think programs varied on the extent to which they used the data in their selection decisions. So questions to ask, really, how valid and reliable are those data? We're trying to select good, is that data? We're trying to select the best interns for our program. So questions to consider is the reliability of the data that we're getting. Are interns reporting those variables the same way? Are they instructed to report them the same way? So do hours mean the same thing across all applicants, or are some reporting things that others aren't? And so it can go wrong in that direction. And then the subjectivity of the process. How do we decide to use those variables as programs? How much weight do we put into them? So our hours are important. Are more hours more important or indicate a better intern than less hours? The same thing with integrated reports and other variables. There's this concept that I think programs use, and clearly it was evident in our program and probably still is as people who train, we know who good applicants are. So we can look at an application and we know who those good applicants are. And I would challenge that maybe that isn't so true, that Sometimes that's accurate, but sometimes that's not very accurate. The problem believing that data means something that it doesn't. I referred to that before. We think that a certain variable may indicate that somebody has competence or skill in an area, and maybe it doesn't because it's not a reliable, valid variable. And then the concept that selection is extremely time-consuming process, and we're all entering that season right now, and we will invest hours and hours of our time and our staff reviewing applications, interviewing. So how much time do we put in, and is it really worth it? Is it cost effective? Are we getting any return for the investment, or can we do this with less hours, more efficiently, equally or more efficiently, and more valid? So our old process, the process at Minneapolis, we use the app, much like I think many programs have done over the years. We use the API variables to inform file review raters on broader program defined domains. So we created domains like research, intervention, assessment, and I will show some of my forms in a little bit. These are very subjective domains, although they may be common across programs. But what we tried to do is we found that ratings were very variable across reviewers. So trying to tighten up those ratings, we refined our operational definitions of what those variables were. And within this, we used our best judgment, but we actually knew very, very little about the actual API variables and what they told us about an applicant's qualification. To some extent, I think many of us think that we know the answer to that, but I would challenge that we probably really don't know the direct relationship between these variables and what it really means about an applicant's qualification. So I know that people may have trouble reading this, so I'm going to try. Bring this over. It's just not an efficient way to do this. So this, which I believe people can see a larger version of the evaluation form. Not going to go through this in detail. This is an example of what we did many years ago. And so we had these broad domains that we developed, that our training program had consensus that these were important things, and people would look at the APIs and review these things. And as you can see, things like essays, work samples, letters of recommendation had very significant weights. Some of the things that evolved over the time was we developed beta weights or multipliers for some of those domains that we thought were more or less important. We also, for certain things, we came up with negative ratings, like on match for internship. If someone was we felt they were a very poor match, they could get a negative rating that would then weight that very. And so this worked. And actually, I believe that there's a lot of programs that borrowed that form from us and used it. And I think it worked. We selected really great interns over the years, but again, very time-consuming process. So more about our old process. And this is just kind of a snapshot of what this consisted of. And I know programs do it very differently. We had selection committee meetings, the first cut meeting where we were deciding who to interview and not interview, a 5-hour meeting, okay? We would have all the reviews done and people would discuss. The reviews, we would develop a ranking list, but that was a starting point. And then people would have discussions about how we would move applicants up or down. In the early years, when I was first hired, before I was training director, and maybe for a little bit into that, this was not always the most collegial process. There were a lot of discussions, a lot of disparaging comments made about certain programs where people maybe have trained. It was very subjective based on the rater. Committee members that were more assertive or maybe even aggressive at times had more influence in the process. It was not fair to certain applicants. And we knew that, and that was our dissatisfaction about why we wanted to kind of improve things. Again, resulted in great internship classes, but not efficient, very subjective. And also want to comment, probably not as sensitive to diverse applicants, but I think maybe people that didn't train in the classic way that maybe I did or other people that had been here for years maybe didn't get argued for as loudly as others. And so that concerned us as well. And then also want to mention the Harvard guidelines with our new process. And the Harvard guidelines are based on faculty searches, but it really talks about how the subjective, actually, I'm going to let Amanda describe them a little bit more. She will do that better than me.
Sure. Yeah. So they are, if you haven't looked at them, they're a great place, I think, to, and relevant, of course, to, I think, our selection. But they talk about how to reduce implicit bias as we're looking at applicants, and also talk pretty specifically about the hazards of selecting someone based on what we would call quote unquote fit, because that ends up tending to lead us to select people who are like us. So this has been kind of a reference point for us as we're going through the application process, trying to remove bias, remove subjectivity to the extent that we can, and not necessarily just kind of go on that gut feeling of who we think is our best fit.
And actually, Amanda, I think I overlapped into, so I'll let you pick it up from here.
Oh, on this slide?
Yes.
Okay. So with this old data, we had, I totally thought you were presenting the slide, so let me just.
Oh, no, I'll pick up. I got confused. Something happened with my notes, and I thought I had done it wrong, so I will continue. So our old process, and this is the way that we understood this, is each rater had their own like sort of internal algorithm. Even though we had a system that we used, people had this internal system about what made for a good applicant. Was it a combination of clinical hours, my favorite type of therapy that I like, my favorite doctoral program, essays that I enjoy reading, or from people that I hold in esteem, how well they interviewed in interview. And, you know, we know that with interview, it's often we tend to rate people out of our conscious awareness higher who are more like us and kind of social and outgoing. My mood on that day could affect it as well also. So like ratings didn't always match up from reviewer to reviewer. Applicants' ratings and where they fell in the process was often dependent on who reviewed them. When we were moving people around in selection committee meetings, that was often done based on who reviewed people. So people like the people that they reviewed and tend to argue for them a little bit stronger. And then interviews could have a dramatic effect on outcome. Our final ranking meeting was similar, 5-hour-long meeting. You know, the rank list was a starting place and we would move people around a fair amount. Okay, so the selection is an expensive endeavor. And so this is just, I came up with this to help convince our staff that we would kind of move in this process. And this is based on kind of real numbers, but there are sort of estimates. So file review, you know, 200 applications, 45 minutes per appy. You know, we had 16 staff doing about 12 and a half reviews each. And you can kind of see as you go on, I won't read every point of that. But the long review meetings, interview process, the ranking meetings, 446 hours total in intern selection, and average cost salary at 100K was about $21,000. So it's a lot of money to invest. And, you know, we're all expected to provide clinical services and do our other jobs while we're in the midst of doing internship selection. And I believe this is where Amanda picks up.
Yes, yep. Yeah, so as Wayne was saying, we were using these variables, but we didn't really understand the variables as well as we wanted to, and we wanted to get more information about what we were working with. So one of the first things that we have done is run some basic descriptives. And so with this, you can see these are the variables, for example, that we were using. The ones with asterisks are dichotomous variables. But one of the things that we were looking at was their range, for example. So you can see we have range of minimum and maximum, means, and standard deviations. One of the things I want to kind of explain as we're going through some of the data that we ended up analyzing or presenting here So the way that Minneapolis VA is set up is that we have six standard track positions and then 2 neuro positions. So just for the purposes of illustration, we're only going to present data that we had for the standard track applicants. We did do this for our neuro applicants, but this is more for kind of illustration purposes. Typically, we rate about 100 applications for those standard track positions. So when we're looking at this data, we were finding that we were curious about the variability. So we found that there were issues when the variability was too big or too small, and what that data meant. So intervention hours, I'll use that as an example kind of throughout this presentation. So intervention, for example, has a pretty big range from 158 hours to about 1,200 hours and a standard deviation of about 200 hours. And it's not really clear to us what those numbers mean. So does an intern applicant who has 800 intervention hours, are they twice as good of an applicant as somebody who has 400 hours? What does that really mean? And so if that doesn't mean that they're twice as good, are there other ways that we can use this data that may be more effective? So generally, we were using this information to help us better understand some of the variables that we were working with. We also ran some correlations. So again, this is the example of intervention hours and how much intervention hours correlated with our final file review rank out of those 100 applicants. So I do want to give some caveats here. One of the things is that we use intervention hours to calculate file review rank. So it's awkward, and there are clearly some things that are complicated about this. But what was most notable was that we would assume that things would be correlated to some extent if you're using one to calculate the other, because there isn't a really great criterion variable that we're working with here. But sometimes we were finding that the variables were not correlated at all. And so that was particularly noteworthy to us. So for this slide, what you can see is that there's a lot of variability, even though it is correlated. And then another way we were looking at the data involved these high-low splits. So out of the applicants that we were ranking, we looked at data from our very top group of file reviews and our bottom group. And so the top ranked group was our applicants that we rated 1 through 15, and our bottom group was applicants rated 40 or lower. And this again is for these 6 standard track positions. So what's interesting about this, again, this is intervention hours, is that intervention hours was not particularly useful in terms of distinguishing how our top group looked and our bottom group looked. So for this slide, true indicates the applicants that were in our top group, bottom is false. So it was interesting to see, like, well, okay, what does intervention hours really mean? And does that really help us distinguish between these 2 groups? So looking at the same thing, but with assessment hours here. So in this graph, you can see similarly, there was a lot of variability. They were correlated, assessment hours, with the final review rank or file review rank. They were correlated, but again, lots of variability here.
Whoops. And here was the core. I'm sorry.
Yep. No, that was, so we are on, if you can go back to assessment hours, I think it's maybe, yep, perfect. So for this one, what we notice here is that this is better at distinguishing between our top and bottom groups. So again, true is our top group of applicants, false was our bottom group of applicants, and there's less overlap between the hours that the applicants were reporting based between the top and the bottom groups. So that's interesting. That's potentially useful information, but we're also using our values here. So one of the things that we were curious about was, does a high number of assessment hours make a good intern? Like, is that something that we really value as a program? Or do we think, for example, that we might be able to train a good applicant in assessment? And so for our site, for example, we've kind of thought, well, assessment hours, this is interesting data, but we can train pretty well in assessment. So this may not be something that we decide to put a lot of stock into. And similarly, going back to those descriptives that I presented at the beginning, assessment hours, there's a pretty big spread. So our range here was from 0 to 655 hours with a standard deviation of over 100. So again, interesting data at least to work with. The next slide is the number of adults seen in intervention. So this was not what we expected. So in this slide, our top group of applicants saw fewer adults for intervention than our bottom group did. And we didn't really know what to make of this. So in some ways, we wondered, does this mean that quality is more important than quantity of adults seen in intervention? It was certainly, again, just another interesting piece of information as we were looking at the data here. And this is our last high-low split that we'll present today. This is exactly, in some ways, like number of intervention hours was. So our high and low groups overlapped a lot in terms of the number of integrated reports that they were reporting. So it's not particularly easy to use this variable to distinguish between our top and bottom groups. And then for this slide, we just kind of looked at correlations. So again, all of the variables that we presented before, how do those variables correlate with the final file review rank? Again, the ones with asterisks are ones that were dichotomous variables, and the ones with plus signs are ones that we ultimately ended up deciding not to use in our file review process for next year. And that was based on a couple of different things. So partially our decision to eliminate certain variables that we were going to be using was based on some of the data that we just ran, but also we were kind of using values too. So there are certain things that we've just sort of decided as a program that it may not make as much sense to include that because it's not adding a lot of value, either in terms of our own values or statistically or sort of mathematically. Let's turn it over to Wayne.
Okay, thank you. So our newer process, I want to comment that the data that Amanda presented is based on the new process and the variables that we defined, because the others, we just didn't have the calculations for that. So then our new process, how do we maximize, and there are questions that we asked ourselves, how do we maximize the use of available API data while minimizing the bias that's inherent in a subjective selection process? And it took a lot of discussions among the training committee and the larger staff for people to really buy in that it was a biased subjective process that really was something that just evolved in terms of how much we were aware of that over time. So then how much subjective judgment should the selection committee members have in this process? How much should data be used and how much should our professional judgment be used? That's a good question, and that's kind of a values question as well also. And then a big question that we've had, which I think represents, is it fair to give preference to applicants that we know? So prac students that we've trained, we know them, we have experience, they're really good, but then does that disadvantage other people who have applied? And then we also recognize that if we do that, that likely decreases diversity because it decreases opportunity for people that we've not worked with. And then through any selection processes, you want to think about type 1 and type 2 error. And, programs, how much do they value that? And where would the preference be? And, even in our new system, as fabulous as it may be, there's error. But as a program, we rather have a type, we rather have type 2 error where we don't want a false positive. So we don't want to get an intern that where our system says they're going to be very qualified, but we end up having trouble with them. And we are willing to have certain error and people fall through the cracks in order not to have that. But we want to try and minimize that error, that point is the idea. So more on the process. So what did we do? 2017, this really started. We formed a small work group from the training committee and we went through the API, tried to identify valuables that we believed were useful. We looked at some data, but we didn't have what we were able to present to you today. So this was really subjective. Where do we think the meaningful data lie? And again, needing to match what we value as a program with the system that we come up with. So then we identified the variables. We tried to refine those variables. How could we make them more uniform? We knew from the beginning a variable like ours, so much variability and like 1,200 hours, we knew wasn't better than 800 hours. And so we used quintiles to do that. And actually this year, we're probably going to set even minimum thresholds and may use terciles to do that even better. But what can you do with that data to try and use it more effectively and minimize maybe error that's in there. And then approach that we did is we started defining new variables. So looking at what's in the API, and can we do what I call derived variables, where the rater is looking at a number of things in the API and coming up with another variable that we derive from that. So as a program, we value training and empirically based practices. So we look at the Vita and try and discern how many EBPs that person has had training in, and then figure out what are our thresholds or values as a program for that. And then also one of the things that we came up with is probably better than ours is number of practicum sites that somebody has trained at. So one may reflect that that's maybe not so great, and that we want more variability than that, but is 5 better than 3? It's good. That's a good question. And then we wanted somebody who had experience with practicum at an academic health center. We're a scientist practitioner model program, and we also wanted people who had experience working in a very large, complex medical center and really didn't need, that was able to kind of handle that complexity. And then diversity, we spend a lot of time trying to rethink that value and getting away from concepts of categorical membership in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, or whatever. And of course, including some of that, but also looking at other things, maybe people that don't reflect personal diversity, but have had training and expertise and experiences in that. So trying to expand that variable so it's a little bit more meaningful. And then, and this is where Chris did a lot of work, is so we have a clinical investigator team, a number of research psychologists here that also do clinical work, but they're mainly research. And they looked at the APIs and determined certain variables, looked at grants they had, publications, rated those, and they also ran publication indexes on people's Vitas, and kind of came up with values that we could then use in our algorithm. And then staff still wanted subjective input, so we created another variable called likability, where the raters could have some subjective input, but it was only really a small part of the algorithm that we came up with. So the algorithm was born. We wanted a way to apply the same metrics to all applicants, to remove the subjective bias. The process required us to choose, what do we value as a program? What was important to us as an internship program? And that could be very different than what you as individual training directors would value. How would we measure this? And then how would we weight these different domains? And those were very involved discussions. So what I wanted to share is, let me share this one first. How am I doing on time? So we had a lot of discussions in our staff about this actual presentation that we're doing and how much we would share about what we actually do in a program. And this is basically what our file review form looks like with the anchors. And I'm just to give you an example is step by step, this is how you review the API. There's not a lot of subjective judgment in it. There's instructions, and people are just putting values in there, and then the algorithm does the calculations. And so things like intervention hours, assessment hours, we're looking at academic and conduct problems, but that's basically a yes or no. And then we would flag those for discussion. Numbers of people seen in intervention, integrator reports, diagnostic interview protocols. So like we determined that assessment hours wasn't very helpful, but how many diagnostic interviews has somebody actually completed? We thought that was more important. And then number of practicum sites. So the reviewer isn't making judgmental determinations. They're making judgments on these individual variables, and then the formula does the work. We do the work with statistics, basically. And I would say staff have some reactions to removing that subjective judgment that they want. People kind of, there's a press for wanting more of that. Oh, I was going to share one more. And this may be helpful. So this is what our actual file review form looks like. It's electronic form in an Access database, and people complete their API reviews, and they're just answering these questions. The other form is just expands on what those questions are and gives more of an operational definition of that. And there's still room. We want people to put their comments on. They want them to explain ratings or things that they see that are concerning or outliers, and we will discuss that in the committee meeting when we're doing our final ranks. Okay. So consequences of this. We believe it's an inherently more reliable process. We've compared people rating reviews, and they're fairly similar. There's some inconsistency, but it's fairly close. We have a more valid system. We think so. We have selected really good internship classes with this. Do we have hard data that we can prove because we have no way of measuring the validity of our process? We can make arguments about the what, who, how of individual candidates, and we do that, and people are sometimes unsatisfied with that. They see an applicant that they really think is fabulous, but the system may not identify them as like this extreme outlier as being as fabulous. But we have to trust the system and let it work. It's incredibly more efficient, and it feels incredibly more fair. And that's a subjective comment from maybe us as training directors, that it feels more fair in almost every way. There's some exceptions. And we believe that it likely increases the diversity of viable applicants, that we're able to kind of, that those applicants that maybe didn't train at maybe programs where I or other people trained are going to get more of a fair shake through this system. So more about the process. So the variables that we rate are combined into domains, and then those are converted into standard scores, and is combined according to weights. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. You know, with the exception of negative flags. So if there's something really concerning in a letter or something else that comes up in terms of conduct problems, the list is the list. And that's an expression that we use because people constantly want to move people around. It's like, oh, this person was great, let's move them up. Nobody can move up. There's no exceptions. And we have stuck to that pretty strong. We have had applicants who there's been concerned about. We've either moved them to the bottom of our rank list or not ranked them, are the decision points. And so it's good to have those rules established ahead of time. So there's not a lot of like arguing, and then the process kind of doesn't pan out as well. Interviews are less weighted. You know, initially we used vignettes and performance-based questions. We decided to have more interviews with more staff. Applicants get more interviews than to use those. It's 1% of our final algorithm because there's so much bias that goes into interviews. As we've talked about many times, there's no real criterion variable. Psychology is a profession. We are terrible at measuring competence in psychologists and doc students and interns. So we have no way of saying what the real criterion is. We have spot checked APIs. So when we've gone through this, we look at who falls high, medium, and low, and we've reviewed those APIs, and subjectively they have fallen where they should. So this is we surveyed our staff, the entire staff, about where they felt the domains should be weighted in the final algorithm. And we use this to inform what we came up with. And I'm not going to go through that all, but you can see there was some fair variability about what people thought was important. And again, this wasn't voting. We weren't going to take the means because we needed to use this to inform what we did. The training committee made the final decisions. And this is the final formula that we have in terms of the domains that we have, what the domains are, the weight that we use for our standard, our general internship track, and then the neuropsych track has different weights that we use because we're looking for kind of a different applicant within those programs. So I'm not going to read through all of that for time's sake. And then a less expensive process than what I had described before. So file review, hold on, I have some notes here I have to see. Bear with me. Yeah, in sum, we've cut 446 hours down to 284. And again, that's not the same every year, but that's pretty substantial. And so we have what is a process that feels a lot more fair, reasonable, efficient, fairer for applicants, and we're spending considerably less time. It's less file review time because it's simpler to go through the API and develop these ratings. And then those 5-hour meetings are now an hour and a half. And basically, it's really like 45 minutes, but we chat a lot at the beginning and at the end because we don't get to see each other much anymore. And much cheaper, over $10,000 cheaper if we were to cost it out by the formula that I used.
So just to kind of follow up on some of what Wayne was saying about interviews there. So we've been talking a lot about our internship sort of file ranking process before the interview. And so because we've been trying really hard to remove subjective bias, and because there's not a lot of literature that interview data is as helpful as we want it to be sometimes, even when we move to performance-based interviews, which of course are better, but still not great. We don't give the interviews a lot of weight. So the way that we end up calculating them is that we have every applicant gets individual interviews with 2 staff members. And then those staff members rate the applicant, and then that creates a sum score that's converted to a T-score. And the interview data really carries about 10% of their final rank placement. So people really don't move around a lot. So once they get their initial placement before they go into the interviews, often their placement isn't moving very much based on their interview score. So you can see the final score is 0.9 times the file review plus 0.1 times the actual interview score. And we've had, I think there's been some debate about, do we want to continue to do interviews and how do we want those to look? But ultimately we've decided to keep the interviews because we think it's really important for the applicant, and probably much more important for the applicant than it is for us. So, I think applicants really want to know where they're going to live for the next year. How is it going to feel for them to talk to the staff members that they might be working with for the next year? And so we keep it partially because we think it's really important for them. I also think that this is where if someone does something completely egregious in the interview, that is data that we take into consideration. So if something comes up in the interview that's a really big red flag, then we would pay attention to that as well. And as Wayne mentioned, there's been a little bit of resistance sometimes. So I think for the most part, this has gone pretty well with our staff, but I think there are a few sticking points. It's been a process to get people to accept the system and the idea that the list is the list and that people can't move around within the list. I think part of that is because we are scientists, but we're also trained in behavioral observation. And so I think people have a really hard time thinking that they shouldn't give any subjective input. So we've been working to get people to trust the algorithm, that idea that we were talking about possible type 2 errors. So this is definitely not a perfect system. We think we're doing better and we're continuing to make it better, or doing our best to do that. But I think there are going to be people that we just miss. So I think there are going to be excellent applicants that unfortunately we may not, that algorithm maybe doesn't work perfectly for. And then as mentioned, people often want to really promote the people that they know if they've had good experiences with them, which is understandable and also maybe not as fair as it could be. So one of the ways that we've been trying to mitigate that and kind of get some buy-in was what Wayne was talking about, where we surveyed supervisors to see how important do you think certain domains should be or certain factors. And so the staff had an opportunity to weigh in and say, this is how important I think research should be when we're considering applicants, or this is how important I think assessment should be, or any number of other variables that we're using in our weights. We're also just reminding them that the old system didn't work any better than we're doing now, but it was a lot more time consuming. And it's evolving. We definitely think that this is something that we are hopefully going to continue to refine over time. We're going to continue to use descriptive statistics and kind of looking at how is this shaking out? Does it seem like it makes sense for us to continue to hold these variables at such high weights or not? And I think this is going to change over time. So this is where if you decide to use any of this system, you'd want to kind of choose based on your own value system. And what a program values may change over time. So this isn't a static process. The other thing that we've been continuing to work on has been refining our operational definitions. So as we were talking about derived variables, I think the more able we are to really make specific definitions, the less it is that there will be variability across raters. And we're doing things like using quintiles or cut scores. So back to that example of intervention hours, if there isn't a significant difference in quality of an applicant between like 800 intervention hours and 1,000 intervention hours, then it may make sense to have either cut scores or use something like quintiles. And where do we go from here? I think we just continue to work on this as much as we can, continuing to look at our data, getting buy-in from our staff and input. I think we as a profession can continue to talk about some of these things. I think especially as we're looking into competencies and ways that we decide to measure competencies. So these competencies, we want doc programs to be able to train their students and serve as gatekeepers. We want to be able to select applicants that we think make sense. The competencies, of course, are applicable to licensure. And I think we as a profession too need to be really mindful of how we view competencies and be able to look at that through a multicultural lens. Just kind of ensuring that some of the ways that we define competence may have, there may be cultural differences in these competencies too.
And then I also want to comment, so the new admissions portal that we use to kind of review and rate rate APPEs. The new portal has an incredible amount of kind of power in terms of what can be done at looking at certain variables, and some of the calculations that we had talked about that we do can be done within the portal. Our hope was that maybe we could show you what some of that looked like. We've not been able to really spend the time to figure all of that out. For our system, because we're using some of the APPE data as is, and then we're using some derived variables that we couldn't just plug the formula or the algorithm in, but it could do some of these calculations for us, which may be easier. And we hope to be able to kind of figure out how to do that. And would say that when we figure that out, we would be happy to kind of share some of that process with people. You know, really do believe in people not having to recreate the wheel and sharing how we can all do this a little bit better. So I think there's a lot that can be done moving forward with that in the new portal. So I think with that, maybe if there are questions or comments that people have, I'm going to stop sharing. And I've not looked at the chat. So one, yeah, so Shona had commented that the new system will allow people to kind of download the data. And that's what we've done for years. It works better through admissions, through the new portal to be able to do that. I think the revision this year, Shona, correct me if I'm wrong, is that will be easier to do. The process will be a lot simpler.
This year, one of the APPE enhancements, and I'm not sure if Dr. Hill is on this call, but is that if you design an evaluation form that's embedded in the portal, that we actually will have the functionality to download those data in Excel, which we couldn't do last year. So that might look really, that might be a nice way to implement your system in the API portal.
Perfect. Like, so the form that I had showed earlier, that was the Access database where people are rating the API and putting those values in, we could build that within admissions. It sounds like pretty easily. We could build the form last year. We just couldn't pull the data down from it. So that would be a huge improvement, and make this process a little bit easier.
Amy, your question is such a good one. So the question is, I love the idea of the list as a list. How do you handle students you might know as research assistants or past practicum students? And I think we try to handle them as objectively as we can. So I would say it's probably best for people not to rate applications of people that they know really well. So we try to give those applications to someone who can be more objective about it. And then we have tried so hard to make the rating system, obviously it can't totally be free of subjectivity, but we've tried really hard to make it as objective as we can so that there isn't a lot of wiggle room in terms of how they're rated. And then we're doing a lot of education with staff to say this is not going to change. So we know them, we like them, we want to appreciate that. And also this is based on our values that we've predetermined as a training program of how we want to select applicants. And that's caused some hurt feelings sometimes. So sometimes our prac students will feel really sad that they don't get interviews or that they don't get selected. And so I think sometimes there's education that needs to be done to with the students about, it's not that we don't like you, it's not that we don't want you to apply for our postdocs or for staff positions in the future. It's just, this is kind of the way our internship program works. Wayne, would you add to that?
No, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think Amanda made a comment about it increasing diversity. I think that we have done, it's hard to measure that because it's hard to know what may be increasing that. I think that we've maybe done a little better over the past few years in terms of having more diverse applicants in our top pool. But I would also say as a program, we have put an incredible amount of work into how we look at diversity in our programming. And so I don't know that it's attributable to the algorithm or not. It feels more fair because it's less biased, but that would be hard to determine.
And our diversity index weights a number of different things. So that's a composite of a number of different factors. And I think in some ways it's diversity, but I think also it's multicultural competence. And so I definitely think we have had incredibly competent classes in the last several years. But I agree, it's hard to measure.
I have a couple of questions and then sort of a comment. One is, I'm wondering, when you assign reviewers to your files, do you pick reviewers whom the applicants have indicated that they want to work with? Or is it just a random assignment? Because I was thinking that people might be more inclined to rate favorably if they think that the applicant wants to come and work for them. And how do your faculty feel about that?
Well, it's random. We have almost 100 psychologists on staff. There are about 16 people on the committee, so we can't really funnel them. We do ask them what like team or rotation they may want, and we may try and we try and match that up with interviews a little bit more than with the file review. The file review is pretty much random because it's objective and it shouldn't really matter. So, some faculty I think would want to have, more of a direct like match in interest, but I think that would probably work against our system.
And then when you have, so if you're not evaluating sort of who they want to work with, and when you end up with your pool of applicants to interview, I'm aware in my program that I want to make sure that they represent different areas. So if we have, 10 applicants in eating disorders out of a pool of, let's say, 25, because those were the 10 that came out using some sort of algorithm, I would feel like that wasn't necessarily fair to my other faculty. So I kind of stratify the list And I'm just wondering how you manage that.
I mean, you maybe have figured out a way to do it, Shona. I think with the way the match works out, even if we were to say we want, 10 on our trauma team, 10 in a primary care mental health, that it wouldn't work out that way because the match it could still work out very differently. So we don't try and do that. We just we just rank people according to how we think they are in terms of overall quality. The only stratification would be neuropsych, but that's a separate match number. And it's a separate process. So we don't try and do that. I think that you could adapt the system to what you're saying if that's what you wanted to do as a program, but we don't. I saw a comment about staff's reaction to de-weighting the interview. And I think some people have had challenges with that. I think it's been a shift in terms of people think that it should be kind of weighted more. But as a program, this is what we decided. And there's things the program or committee decides that maybe I don't agree with. But as long as I don't feel that it's like an egregious decision, we need to have consensus, and it's not a monarchy. And it would be really bad if it was, because if I or Amanda were making the decisions or exerting too much influence, and maybe something didn't work out so well, then that would be really hard for people to work with. So it really does need to be a collective agreement as much as possible. It is a shift. People intuitively, I think psychologists should be aware that interview is not a very reliable piece of information, but people still think they know, and it's hard to let go of that idea for a lot of people, and for me as well too. But I'm reading in the chat, or people can speak up if there's things we've not addressed that people have questions about.
Have you had any surprises in recent years that have come with the use of your algorithm in terms of the class that it has yielded for you?
I can let Amanda chime in as well, but what I would say is actually there's an article, I forget what year it was published, that we published in TEP maybe 12 years ago, and we looked at our competency data from rating interns. And then we looked at the data that we had from the API. And basically we found very little relationship between any of the API variables and the competency data. Now, restriction of range is a big problem, but we also looked at, we had a group of, I think it was like 7 supervisors who had been there for a number of years, and we ordinarily ranked our intern classes. Any prior interns might be horrified to learn that we did that. But we actually found as inverse relationships in many cases. Again, restricted range is an incredible problem, but sometimes the intern that was lower on our rank list that we matched with was perceived to be the best intern in that class, which just demonstrates that the system isn't very good at that level of discrimination because you have an incredible restricted range. We match. Most people we interview would be great interns. And so what our job really is to figure out the ones that maybe wouldn't be, and trying to get the best if we can. Trying to read this in the chat.
Yep.
Amanda, anything to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that's come up is kind of something that we've talked about quite a lot as a class, is that we had a prac student a couple of years ago who was an excellent prac student, and well, this has happened a couple of times, an excellent prac student, and they have not been selected, or they've fallen pretty far down on the list comparatively to what we would have expected. And so we have in those cases, so that may be kind of a surprise, like we were surprised to see that. And so really what we've done in those cases is continue to hold the list as the list, but also then use that information as we move forward in the future, because we think, okay, maybe that means that there's something about the algorithm that we need to tweak in some way, because maybe something is falling through the cracks, or maybe that's an example of that type 2 error that we could work on improving in the future.
Thank you. I'm reading the comment by Carrie Tully. Carrie, would you unmute and maybe ask your question? I'm not sure that I really understand, if you don't mind.
I interpreted the question as asking, like, how do we know that raters are going to be consistent or reliable? And we do, for example, like we have postdocs rating applications, and when people are rating for the first time, we do hold an informational session before they start rating the applications to train them about what it means, like where do they find this information, how do we consider these variables, and then we sit down and go through the applications with them. So all the postdocs who are rating applications for the first time, for example, have to meet with Wayne or me to go over their file review ratings with us.
Right. And it's been a couple of years since we've done this, but when we did the checks about people reviewing the appies of people who fell low, medium, and high on our list to see if those were accurate, we did look at the reviews as well to check whether those are accurate. And there, there's going to be disagreement a little bit on a few ratings, and I don't have a number to report, but for the most part, they're very consistent. We've also found that if you have a lower range, excuse me, if you have a lower range in a rating, so if you're using a Likert scale or something to rate something, even 1 to 5, you get a lot more inconsistency. So if it's something where you can restrict kind of the rating, you're going to get more reliability. Now that may not be feasible in all cases, and so a lot of times we have dichotomous variables that we're using. Or it may be, there may be an opportunity for like someone will get like a lower deficient rating on something. We would say that most really good applicants would be a 0, which gives them nothing. And then you could get a 2 or a 3 if somebody was really like outstanding in that area. But again, trying to restrict that seems to get a little more consistency among raters.
So we probably get about 100 applications for our standard track. We rank almost everybody unless there's something really unusual about the application. And I bet we interview 35-ish for the standard track.
Yeah.
So you rank everyone even if you didn't interview them?
No. No, so we'll get about 100 applications for our standard track, and we'll interview about 35 sometimes. We interviewed a little more last year because it was easier to manage through, we didn't need the space, so we did it remotely. So we did a little bit more, and then we will only rank people that we interview. And then there may be 1 or 2 applicants a year that don't get ranked that we interviewed, where maybe we discovered something that we would rather not risk. Well, our hope is that maybe people would adopt some of what we're talking about. I would say if people have questions, Amanda or I would be happy to kind of chat with you about kind of what you're doing. I would be happy to share materials. And then if people are doing similar things or have come up with different derived variables or ways to do this, would be interested to learn what other people are doing that we can kind of adapt that could make our system more reliable, more efficient, and valid, hopefully. And put in a plug, maybe at some point we would move to a competency-based system and away from some metrics that really seem to be not so reliable, and that would be an easier process for everybody and our applicants too. Amanda, anything else before we wrap up?
No, I just really appreciate everybody's participation and attendance. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Appreciate the opportunity from APIC to present. I think we started, or the proposal was originally for the 2019 conference.
2020, I think. It was the COVID,
2020, yes,
COVID
yes, and then
the spread
COVID,
conference.
then COVID happened. So, right. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The slides will be sent to you by email and also posted on the website along with the transcript of the chat.
Excellent. All right. Thank you again. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye now.